Can games be a spiritual experience? Let's find out. Recently, a guy named Ryan Hornbeck, a cognitive anthropologist, studied spirituality in a really unusual place. The ultra-popular MMO, World of Warcraft. You've probably heard of it before. So the players that he studied were Chinese, and a lot of them were atheists, yet a lot of them documented what we would call spiritual experiences while playing. His conclusion was that all the raiding and more healing was creating intense feelings of spiritual connectedness. Naturally, I was a little bit skeptical. How could I, or anyone else for that matter, have a life-changing spiritual moment while slaying packs of boars with a giant anthropomorphized panda? Not to mention, I'm in my living room in my sweatpants drinking lots of Jolt, which I've been hoarding since the 90s. But it is hard to deny the testimony that Hornbeck collected from players. They said things like, "WoW has given me a spiritual feast of unconditional loyalty and friendship. You will be able to see the souls of players set free, and in turn, you will be warmed by them. Playing a character in the game is playing the soul of a person." That's some pretty heady stuff, and part of me wants to believe it's just the work of an overreaching translator, but these players were clearly experiencing something. So that made me curious, can games evoke spiritual experiences? And if so, how? But before we dive into it, let's back up a little bit. A lot of you are probably wondering, how does one define a spiritual experience? There are lots of different ways to slice it, but the definition that we're gonna go with comes from Swedish sociologist Lars Tornstam and his concept of cosmic transcendence. He defined it as an increased feeling of unity or communion with the spirit of the universe, which could mean a bunch of different things depending on your worldview. But what's important is that it redefines our relationship to space, time, to objects. It makes us feel less materialistic and self-centered. It gives innate feelings of meaning to our lives, and lots of other good stuff. And though the direct experience of transcendence may only last a little while, which is kind of a bummer, it is very intense, and if you have lots of these types of feelings on a regular basis, it can have a profound effect on who you are. Just so we're totally crystal clear, I'm not saying that video games are a religion. Yes, you can have spiritual experiences by participating in organized religion. In fact, a lot of people do. That's why they join them in the first place. But a lot of others report having spiritual experiences, as I defined it earlier, from distinctly non-religious practice. For example, many astronauts report a profound feeling of bliss and inner peace from seeing the Earth from outer space. There's a name for it. It's called the overview effect. Others report having that feeling from non-religious meditation. And what's remarkable is that Tornstam's definition of transcendence sounds a lot like what those Chinese WoW players were experiencing. Here's another quote as a kicker. "What we are playing is not merely a game. In World of Warcraft, we find a feeling of existence that we cannot find in the real world." That's pretty deep stuff. So what I'm wondering is, why is this cosmic state triggered for players in a game about slaying giant dragons or conquering foreign lands? Well, it does appear that games in the right conditions can propel us towards spiritual values that point to something bigger than ourselves. As Hornbeck says, games can fill us with strong upwellings of moral sentiment. The question is, what does an ogre in a kilt have to do with any of this? Well, let's dive into this. I think there are two parts. What makes games games is that they're separate from our other everyday experiences. So whether it's video games, basketball, or Calvin ball, we submit to a special set of rules. By doing so, you're abandoning how the real world works and allowing yourself to become completely a part of the game. We've all had experiences like this, when every other part of life all just slips away and you're totally engrossed. Spiritual experience is just the next level. It takes what you've already given over to the power of play and intensifies those feelings. The second aspect is community. Sure, from a totally objective point of view, the only thing that you're doing when you play a game is interacting with a complex computer system. Azeroth might not be real in the traditional sense of the word, but the people that you're playing with sure are, especially in a game like World of Warcraft where strong social bonds are paramount. Hornbeck says that WoW spams and exaggerates the stuff of moral cognition. By that he means that players are participating in spiritually fertile activities. So that would be altruistic acts like casting healing spells or participating in a community with your guildmates. This creates a powerful feeling of connectedness. This doesn't happen so much in real life because the real world is not designed for the same type of positive social interactions. I mean, here in New York, just look at the subway or the entrance to the Holland Tunnel. But in MMOs like World of Warcraft, it totally makes sense, because the land of Azeroth is specifically attuned to keep players working together to win, unless you're someone who likes lone wolfing it. Of course, this sense of connection isn't limited to just World of Warcraft. You see it in Dark Souls, during that really impossible boss battle where that shirtless warrior with dual axes came back to your side like 30 times until you won.
See you later, man-eater.
And then there are games like Journey, where people have these deep emotional experiences for reasons that maybe we can't yet understand.
I don't like seeing the world in turmoil like this. I want to free it. I want to help all the little creatures.
For example, there's this incredible post written by a Journey player titled, "Is it possible to have a religious experience in a video game?" The post closes, I don't even know, man. I'm crying, so many feels. If that's not the face of Transcendence, then I don't know what is. While it definitely seems that forming strong social interactions is important for creating meaningful experiences, I'm not sure we have to limit it to just multiplayer games. For example, the NYU Game Center's director Frank Lance says that he experiences the transcendentally beautiful when he plays poker at a high level. And sound designer turned game designer Robin Arnault is attempting to channel something deeper in his meditative breathing game Sound Cell. Mike over at Idea Channel also did a great episode on the meditative qualities of bullet hell games, which you can watch right here. In his book, Human Evolution from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age, sociologist Robert Bellah argues that pre-human mammalian play may have prepared the cognitive space for us to have spiritual concepts. So it seems that transcendence is a possibility for all games. And ultimately, this is a question worth asking, because it helps game designers figure out new ways to add value and meaning to the lives of people who play their games, instead of just creating fun, disposable ways to kill a few minutes, a couple hours, or years. So what do you think? Have you ever had a spiritual experience while playing games? And why do you think that happened? Hash it out in the comments, and if you like what you saw, please subscribe. I'll see you next week. Last week we talked about whether or not we should get rid of the indie in indie games. Let's see what you had to say. Tanner RT agrees, well, sorta, with the idea we should get rid of indie games, specifically pointing out this idea that indie as a concept loses its meaning as long as people keep arguing back and forth about what is indie and what isn't indie. So if it's used as a way to exclude people, then it's not a very useful term, and I would totally agree with him. The one thing is, I don't know if I necessarily agree that the thing that defines indie games is funding. As I said in the episode, I think that funding can be part of the spectrum, but ultimately the word indie has such complicated definitions for most people that we should just get rid of it in the first place. Yeah? Evan Vanderberg says the term indie has become like reality TV or pop. I actually think it's probably more like craft beer, right? So there was a point in time where craft beer, which was made by small breweries at a time when there was limited distribution, actually had a term and implied a certain amount of experimentation. But now a lot of those craft breweries have been purchased in part by larger multinational beverage corporations, and that term craft doesn't really mean the same thing that it used to. So yeah, I think you're right. It's kind of like this big container that a lot of stuff gets thrown into, but it's lost its specificity. Good point. Van Wolf, I sort of agree with you, except for that last part where you're saying that indie is like a first-person shooter, a role-playing game that is this descriptor. The problem is that I think with FPSs or RPGs, there are some boundaries. People sort of agree about where the edges lie, because it's tied more to the mechanics. The problem with indie as a term is that there's nothing that indie games necessarily have in common, except that they want to be marketed as indie games. There aren't any specific mechanics that are like indie mechanics. There isn't an aesthetic thing that's specifically an indie aesthetic. So yeah, I just think we should abandon the term altogether. Slenderman Zero says a lot of people look at indie games and say, oh, it's not made by EA, and that's what makes it good. Well, I mean, EA does make some good stuff. I mean, for people out there who like Titanfall, for example, I mean, it's made by Respawn, but it's published by EA. Or if you're a big Madden person, then you would really be into EA stuff. I think the reality is that games are hard to make. So indie or mainstream, there are good and bad games all up and down the spectrum. Being indie doesn't necessarily mean you get this like magic indie pixie dust to make things all better. Olton Gannon caught me. I did. I got a haircut. I told the guy not to take quite so much off, but you know, we shoot every week, so I can't do anything about it. I'm sorry. Hero Gamer 555 says that indie games are not appealing because he or she doesn't want to pay for something they're not sure if they're gonna like ultimately. And I'm curious how it's any different than anything else that you buy, I guess. I mean, yeah, there are good things and there are bad things, but I don't know if trying things out for 6 hours at a time is necessarily gonna help, but Yeah. Oh, and in terms of the spectacle thing, I mean, that's kind of relative, right? It depends what you mean by spectacle, because I think that's something that smaller teams are now able to do in a big way. Again, No Man's Sky, which was the total darling at this year's VGX. I mean, that's as much of a spectacle as anything that I've seen in a long time. So, yeah, there's good stuff everywhere. Ogre Samasuke says that the term indie is indicative of a particular subculture, which is exactly what I take issue with. I'm not sure that we can define indie as a subculture, and like in what sense and in what context. Like, if you were able to give me like a manifesto or a specific definition about like what constitutes indie games as a subculture, I think at this point the world has become so big and the circumstances in which independent indie games have developed are so varied that I don't think it's even like a really useful term anymore. And I don't know, like, I sort of get what you're saying about mainstream games being cloney, but like, aren't indie games cloney too? I mean, I've seen so many like terrible platformers. So a lot, I think it's just that making games is really difficult, and a lot of the creative difficulties that big teams face, small teams face them also. Surefire Rocks asks if Arcade Fire constitutes an indie band, and I think much like music, games are going through a similar sort of process. Like in music, indie meant a specific thing. It meant that you were acting outside of the big four record labels, and you actually could not get your music to people unless you went through the big four record labels. With games, that might have been true like 30 years ago, but it's not really true anymore, in the sense that in the last decade, we've had the internet, in the last 15 years, we've had the internet and the ability to digitally distribute titles. So just like in music, I feel like the term indie doesn't really mean a whole lot anymore, because people just listen to music, period, end stop. And there are small bands that have like wide footprints like Arcade Fire. I think that games are undergoing the same process. So we should get rid of the term.